Pop-Up Playdays 2020 Junior Ranger Richland logo. A female ranger stands on the beach wearing a National Park Service uniform and facial mask.
Hello, Junior Rangers! I'm Ranger Emily and I work at Manhattan Project National Historical Park in Washington. I'm going to go ahead and remove my mask so you can hear me better. Today I am at Leslie Groves Park in Richland, Washington. Leslie Groves Park is named after General Leslie Groves.
A black and white photograph of General Leslie Groves sitting at his desk holding a pen.
General Groves was an engineer and the person in charge of the Manhattan Project. For today's Pop-Up Playday video, we're going to be talking about the engineers and scientists of the Manhattan Project.
A black and white photograph of workers in lab coats inside of the B reactor.
During World War II, scientists, engineers, and mathematicians made huge advancements in STEM.
A colorized STEM graphic. The text reads Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics.
STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. People from around the world invented new technology during World War II so they could win the Great War.
A black and white photograph of a radar system on a beach. Many people surround the radar system. A few people are sitting next to or on the radar. A black and white photograph of a large computer with two women using the computer. A black and white photograph of a large rocket.
The British invented radar systems and computers to crack secret German codes. Germans improved rocket technology.
Black and white photograph of the gadget, a plutonium device that looks like a large globe connected to many wires.
Here in the United States, the Manhattan Project scientists, engineers, and mathematicians advanced nuclear science.
A colored picture of an African American woman wearing a headscarf riveting a sheet of metal. A black and white photograph of a tank going over an obstacle course. A black and white photograph of a submarine cutting through the ocean.
Experts were not the only people to use STEM skills during World War II. Soldiers and factory workers used STEM to build tanks and submarines, to read maps, to understand radar signals, and to navigate ships and airplanes.
A black and white photograph of two large ships in an ocean with a plane flying overhead.
Many famous scientists across the United States worked on the Manhattan Project. Most of the Manhattan Project scientists worked in Chicago, Illinois, and Los Alamos, New Mexico.
A black and white photograph of Enrico Fermi drawing math equations on a chalkboard.
Enrico Fermi, an Italian physicist, lived in the United States and worked for the Manhattan Project at the Chicago Metallurgic Lab.
A black and white photograph of Enrico Fermi and his team standing in front of a sign that reads, on December 2nd, 1942, man achieved here the first self-sustaining chain reaction and thereby initiated the controlled release of nuclear energy.
In 1942, Fermi and his team created the world's first nuclear reactor called the Chicago Pile 1.
Black and white photographs of models of the Chicago Pile 1.
Manhattan Project scientists and engineers took the lessons learned from Fermi's lab to build the world's first full-scale nuclear reactor, named the B reactor.
A black and white photograph of men constructing the B reactor. A black and white aerial photo of the B reactor and the Manhattan Project buildings. A colored photograph of the B reactor at dusk.
The B reactor was built on the Hanford Reservation in Washington for the Manhattan Project. Today, the B reactor is part of Manhattan Project National Historical Park. You will be able to visit and tour the B reactor with your family and friends once it reopens.
A colored photograph of a B reactor tour guide and visitors standing in front of a railing inside of the B reactor. A colored photograph of a visitor taking photographs of the interior technology of the B reactor.
Another scientist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, was the person in charge of the Los Alamos team of scientists that researched, designed, and built the first atomic bombs.
A black and white photograph of J. Robert Oppenheimer. A black and white photograph of Oppenheimer with two men, One of the men is adjusting the levers on a machine.
Oppenheimer is often called the father of the atomic bomb. Most of the scientists and engineers who worked on the Manhattan Project were men. Leona Woods Marshall Libby was the only woman officially working as a scientist at Hanford.
A black and white photograph of Leona Woods Marshall Libby.
Engineers were very important to the Manhattan Project, and they outnumbered Manhattan Project scientists 10 to 1. Engineers study how and why things work. They design and build solutions to big and small problems.
A black and white photograph of the plutonium buildings at Hanford, Washington.
Engineers designed the buildings to produce plutonium.
A colorized photo looking up at the B reactor. A black and white photograph of a man wearing rubber gloves holding a cake of plutonium. A colored photograph of the backside of the B reactor.
The B reactor at Hanford was the first full-size nuclear reactor to produce plutonium. Because the B reactor was the first of its kind, it was a big achievement for the engineers and scientists who designed and built it. Most of the engineers who worked on the Manhattan Project worked for either the Army Corps of Engineers or the DuPont Corporation. The Army Corps of Engineers are the engineers who worked for the United States Army to build public works like dams and bridges. The DuPont Corporation is a private company that specialized in chemical engineering during the World War II era.
A black and white photograph of a smiling General Groves sitting at his desk holding a pen.
General Groves asked the DuPont Corporation and the Army Corps of Engineers to engineer and build the Manhattan Project. Engineers and scientists had to work together to make the Manhattan Project successful. It was the job of the DuPont engineers to take the Manhattan Project scientists' ideas and make them come to life.
A black and white portrait of Crawford Greenwalt.
Crawford Greenwalt worked for DuPont as a chemical engineer. It was his job to take the scientists' ideas and have the DuPont engineers create the blueprints for the projects and to solve any engineering problems. For example, Greenwalt took the idea of the B reactor from the Manhattan Project scientists and worked with the DuPont engineers to design and build the B reactor.
A black and white photograph of several men constructing the B reactor.
Construction on the Hanford B reactor began in 1943. DuPont hired over 50,000 workers from around the country to work at the Hanford site.
A black and white photograph of an aerial view of the Manhattan Project, including the B reactor. A black and white photograph of two children and a woman playing outside of a house next to a garden. A second house is in the background.
By the end of World War II, DuPont and the Army Corps of Engineers had engineered nuclear reactors, hundreds of miles of roads and railroads, housing for thousands of people, and groundbreaking technology. Civil engineers built the Grand Coulee Dam and Bonneville Dam, which produced the power for the Manhattan Project. The hydroelectricity, the power created by the Grand Coulee Dam, was also used to produce aluminum for World War II ships and planes. The American Society of Civil Engineers considers the Grand Coulee Dam to be one of the 7 civil engineering wonders of the United States.
A colored photograph of the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River.
There were many different types of engineers who worked on the Manhattan Project. You can learn more about the different types of engineers, including nature's engineers, beavers, in your pop-up Playdays passport.
A colored photograph of a beaver.
Remember to download and complete this week's passport activities so you can earn your Junior Ranger pin or patch. Our friend Diana from Taptail Greenway is excited to tell you about nature's engineers. Check out Diana's video about beavers on the City of Richland's website. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you in 2 weeks for a pop-up Playdays video where we're going to talk about building a community and alphabet houses.
An image of the National Park Service arrowhead overlaid over a scene of the Columbia River next to a sandy beach. An image of the City of Richland's Parks and Recreation logo. Rolling credits. Text reads, photographs courtesy of Department of Energy, National Park Service, black and white portrait of Crawford Greenwalt courtesy of the Atomic Heritage Foundation, STEM graphic shared by Gabriel Ocana Rebello